Hello, I'm Alexandra Mcarver, and welcome to today's episode of Behind the Headlines. I'm with Theogony, T.C. Williams' student-run media organization, and here's my panel. So today I have Michael Pope, who's a reporter for the Virginia Public Radio, Denise Dunbar, who's a publisher for the Alexandria Times, and Vernon Miles, who is a reporter for Alex Now. Today, our panel will discuss the expansion of the scooter pilot program, the controversy over TC field lights, and the cooperation between Alexandria and Arlington over Amazon. So right now, scooters are everywhere in this city, in the city, and they only seem to be growing. So Denise Dunbar, I understand that you have a very strong opinion about this.
I'm not a fan. So here's the deal. The city uses data to justify things that it wants to do, and it ignores data when it doesn't tell the story that it wants it to tell. Mm-hmm. The data from the 8 months of scooter usage is very clear that these scooters are not some, wonderful addition to our transportation system, that thousands of people are using them for, the last mile of transportation to work. It actually tells the exact opposite story. So there have been roughly 200,000 rides that took place in the 8 months of the pilot program for which we have data. But there were 115,000 separate riders. So that means that there were less than 2 rides per rider. Okay, so if you do the math, it's not mathematically possible for there to be large quantities of people riding this to and from work or to and from the metro each day. If a person were to have ridden this back and forth to work most of the time in those 8 months, they would have had 320 rides. My guess, if you take it down to 250 rides is a more reasonable number. The city has not given us the breakdown that way, so we don't actually know. But if you did the calculations, like even 100 people riding it 250 times, it doesn't leave enough other people to have done all the other rides. So people who are saying that this is some grand transportation, new invention and people are widely using it, they're not.
So do you think this is going to affect public transportation in Alexandria, like the dash buses and the metro?
No. No, this is a fad that is being implemented to create vibrancy in the waterfront, and it's being done at the expense of the livability of people, particularly in Old Town. And I think it's a real shame. The new pilot that they're proposing for next year is actually proposing to allow people to ride on the sidewalk. They say they're going to limit that to 6 miles per hour, but there's no enforcement mechanism, and they're not going to be able to limit it to 6 miles per hour. So, I certainly hope that if they decide to do a second pilot, that at a minimum they take that out, because that's just a disaster waiting to happen.
The issue of the sidewalks is really the biggest, thorniest question that needs to be answered before you move into the second part of the pilot, because the original pilot, pilot version 1, was that the scooters were not allowed on the sidewalks and they were only allowed on the streets. Well, the problem with that is that you don't want to treat them like cars, because they also have a speed limit, and the machines themselves are actually programmed in a way to reduce the top speed they could have. In other words, they could go faster, they could go much faster, but they're engineered to go slower so that they comply with all of the local regulations of all the governments. So this is where you get into the issue of the sidewalks. Are we going to treat them like cars, or are we going to treat them like bicycles?
They're motorized vehicles. They shouldn't be on sidewalks.
So then that argument is they should go faster. So like if you want to treat them like they're vehicles, make sure they're on the streets and let them go faster. If you're going to treat them like a bicycle, let them use the sidewalk. This is the issue they need to address before they move into the second part of the pilot.
Well, and I think the other thing that's going to have to be addressed with scooters is parking for the scooters, because that's been a big issue, especially like downtown, on the waterfront, stuff like that. They've started taking steps like geofencing to keep people from parking on like the docks at the waterfront, but they're going to need to really find a way to get people into those corrals that they've set up and keep them from being just left around on the street. I think scooters are a hell of a lot of fun. Can I say hell? They're a lot of fun. And so I like driving around Old Town. I'm one of the horrible young people who's doing so. And but you do feel this guilty feeling as you just leave it out in front of somebody's house. I still do it, but you do have that, like, you have to find a way to build in mechanisms that keep that from happening, because it's not sustainable.
Denise was talking about the sort of livability in Old Town, and I will say it's important to note that some people in Old Town actually like these things and like riding them. So this is not like everybody in Old Town hates them and they screw up the livability.
It's not everybody. I do think they screw up the livability, and it's joyriding. So I think that the big picture policy thing is it worth it? Is it worth it to our city to have this disruption that a lot of people view it as simply for pleasure? You know, as I said in an editorial, a lot of people really like ponies too. Should the city be providing ponies for everyone simply because it's fun and it might make our waterfront more vibrant? I don't think so.
Ponies,
Rabbits. Ponies and rabbits.
Ponies and rabbits.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with mostly everything that you've said, and my dad would agree with you too. But our next topic about Amazon. So recent months have seen a lot more meetings between Alexandria and Arlington officials than have ever really happened before in this county. So it's like, how did it feel for you? So Vernon, you cover a lot of the Alexandria officials and the Arlington officials, but how did it feel to see them all interacting in one room? Was it like when the Avengers got together in like one movie?
Well, like the Avengers, I think there's this feeling of, you know, you get to see these people in their own environments and you get a lot of sense of like what they do and what they accomplish. But when they work together, sometimes it can be kind of a hollow experience where you're left with just caricatures of each of them. And I think that's, you know, something that you kind of run the risk of when you have that many people of such a high caliber in the same room together. I think you're going to need to see a lot more definitive commitments and definitive plans moving forward than what we've seen so far. A lot of what we've heard at meetings between Alexandria and Arlington are icebreakers. There are things like, oh, do we think affordable housing is something we should be investing in? And there's not a lot of actual like plans being laid out and actual strategies being defined for how you move forward. And Amazon is coming to town. And I don't think they have time to wait around. They don't have time to do icebreakers. They need to start getting those things like put into concrete for how they're handling that.
Yeah. How do you think Amazon moving in is going to affect like local businesses in this area?
I think you're already starting to see some businesses getting pushed out. There's a nail salon that was in Crystal City that just moved down to the Arlandria area, and that's great for the Arlandria area. But you're going to start seeing more and more businesses like pushed further and further out into Alexandria, into Fairfax, and I think it's going to change the tenor of those neighborhoods. Not necessarily for better, not necessarily for worse, but there's people living on Columbia Pike right now who in a couple of years might not be able to afford to live in the same places that they currently live. And I think you're going to start seeing that in Arlandria, and I don't know if the city's prepared to handle that.
Yeah. Sometimes this area acts as a little bubble with all these local businesses that we can go to for all of our needs, and I think Amazon might work to pop that bubble a little bit, which could be good or bad. We'll have to see. So our last topic is the TC lights controversy, which has been going on for a while. And there was, this started with the people that live behind the TC field, and although adding lights would help TC games play after sunset, these people that live behind it believe that their ancestors were promised never to have lights around the 1960s, and since then they've been holding on to that promise. And how do you feel like this promise holds up today, Mr. Pope? I mean, I think, yes, it's a promise, but was it put in writing? Do you think it still holds true today?
Well, there is a lawsuit that challenges that. You know, there's a couple issues here that I think are worth thinking about. One of them is this promise that was made back in the 1960s to the neighbors there. The people and their descendants who live in that neighborhood feel like that there's a promise, and let's not break the promise. You also have to wonder, is that a promise that goes on forever? Like, for example, like what happens in the year 2022? Is that a promise that should be valid 100 years from now, or many years into the future? Does it have an expiration date at some point? That's something I think the people need to wrestle with. The courts need to wrestle with. There is this lawsuit that's about to really cause some waves. There is a court date we're talking about here. February 24th is the court date when they're going to start jury selection, and there's actually going to be a jury trial. And they brought in this judge from Loudoun because of all of our local judges said, recused themselves. They don't want to get involved in this. And so if you actually get testimony and days of hearings, and there's going to be a lot of drama in this court proceeding, I think.
So honestly, I think that a better approach to this would be to look forward rather than to look backward. I think that a lot of people do believe that there was a verbal promise made. I think the question is whether a verbal promise is legally binding. It is in a lot of instances, and as Michael said, for how long it's binding. I think a better way to look at this, though, is to look forward, which is at some point in time, I firmly believe Alexandria is going to need a second high school. That issue was not approved recently by the school board, but I think that this could be a little bit of a case of kicking the can down the road. The next recession that might come, a lot of students who are currently in private schools may be sent to public schools, and I think that the enrollment, high school enrollment in the city could jump up yet again. And at some point, we're going to reach a level where one high school just isn't going to get it done. So why not solve, look down the road to that, put a lighted high school somewhere else in this city that T.C. Williams can use now, that a second high school can use later, and be done with all the litigation.
Yeah, but speaking of sports between, if we have a second high school, speaking of sports between those two, do you think it'll lead to a lot of city rivalries between people just in Alexandria?
I think that's good. I mean, think about most cities have multiple high schools, and they're constructive rivalries for the most part. It builds school spirit within your school. You want to really beat your rival more than you want to beat somebody else, but it's not really a negative thing. And I think that, and this is another topic, but a lot of people have raised the issue of equity. I think there are equity issues any way you slice this, whether it's within one high school or whether it's multiple.
And as somebody who stole the mascot from my rival high school, I agree. I think rivalries can be a good thing for high schools, but I do think there's other things that the schools have to consider looking down the road, is that they only have numbers for so far in the future. And it's easy to say, yes, like the population is going to continue growing, but we've had populations shrink in the past. It goes in waves up and down. And I think the school has to approach this somewhat cautiously, because they don't want to be coming back in a couple decades having to tear down schools or having to repurpose schools that they built, planning for an upswing that didn't actually happen. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. I think it's very likely that it will continue to grow, but I think that's something that's very much on the school's mind as they start planning for the future. I think it's only like 10 years down the road is what they have projections for, 10 or 15. So if you look past that for when you're going to be building your schools, it gets a lot more tricky.
Yeah, we'll have to see. So thank you all for joining me here. That was our episode of Behind the Headline. Again, I was with Michael Pope, Denise Dunbar, and Vernon Miles, and I will see you next time. Thank you.